Welcome to Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, just to hear it out loud. Join Toby Malone and TJ Young, along with some special friends, as we puzzle our way through what we once thought was an unreadable book to produce a surprisingly listenable podcast.
Welcome to a bonus episode of Wake, the podcast that jingles and jangles and shines and gleams as we work towards fulfilling a long-held bucket list, or should I say, Christmas list item, reading James Joyce's Finnegans Wake out loud just once. I'm your host, Toby Malone, here solo for this special Christmas season episode of Wake. I wanted to ensure that we had something to release over the holiday season, but I also didn't want to burn off one of our reading episodes when everyone's celebrating, so I thought I'd create this short episode to touch on how our good friend James Joyce treated this holiday. Of course, this won't age well for those of you listening later in the year, but for those hearing this on the release day, it is Christmas Eve 2024. I hope everyone out there is having a wonderful holiday, no matter what you celebrate. This is, of course, a non-exhaustive episode. Many hundreds of pages have been written by scholars far better read than I am about representations of Christmas in Joyce's works. And, of course, as you should expect, I've read nearly none of them. I mean, what kind of episode of Wake would it be if I'd done all the research and offered an exhaustive account? What I have done, however, is in the spirit of the season. I've gone through all four of Joyce's major works and pulled out all the mentions of the Christmas holiday. I am absolutely 100% certain that there are allusions that I have missed, which includes corruptions of words or references or other non-Christian holidays. So I offer a mea culpa by suggesting that the point here is not to be exhaustive, but to check out how Joyce gave a surprisingly even account of Christmas in all of his major works. I will say that I am going to cite page numbers as I go, but all of these are wildly inconsistent. I've been spoiled by the universality of the Wake when it comes to pagination. All of my references are to the editions of the book available on the Internet Archive, and to my chagrin, when I tried to cross-reference them with my physical copies, I found it more trouble than it was worth. So forgive me my inexactitude, and you can always Google things if you need to follow along and find out exactly what I'm referencing. So let's get started. So the most important representation of Christmas in all of Joyce comes very early on. In fact, in his first few stories, in his incredibly accessible and beautiful Dubliners, which was published in dribs and drabs in magazines and the like until it was collated under its final title. It was published in 1914, but it took him about a decade to actually get the thing together because there was all sorts of controversy about the content. It's kind of amazing now reading it to think that any of these stories could be controversial, since all of them seem very benign right now, but apparently there was a lot of concern about libel and people being able to identify themselves in these stories. So we had things like printers refusing to publish things or print things. We had copies of the manuscript being burned. We had all sorts of different things going on. And to read it now, it all seems like a series of kind of sweet, kind of quaint, if pretty sad series of stories. I actually decided to reread the Dubliners this week to prepare for this episode. I started sort of browsing through, hadn't read it in maybe a decade or more. And what I did find, I was really overwhelmed by how beautifully it's written, particularly having immersed myself in the Wake so much over the last year. So seeing the young Joyce on his way to getting wrapped up in unravelling the English language is truly breathtaking. The first story, The Sisters, was his first publication, which he published in a magazine in 1904, and it shows an incredibly canny knack for character and the unsaid. It's kind of amazing that this was his first one. I don't know if it was his first one he ever wrote, but the subject matter is not the kind of thing that you would think a novice writer would get into, which just shows us just how extraordinary Joyce was, that he started with The Sisters. This is a writer who really has no interest in leading the reader by the hand, and that's so interesting, like the maturity of what these stories show us. He's not really interested in happy endings for the sake of it all. There's kind of a hopelessness that's baked into the world where the lives are lived without comment and where deeply flawed people struggle their way through the world. So I'm not going to go through each of the books individually or all of these stories in Dubliners. I thoroughly enjoyed rereading Dubliners as a lead into The Dead, which was the final story in the collection, which is a sneaky Christmas time story, and we'll get to that in a moment. The Dead is one that Mark Wallace has said. He says, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol aside, James Joyce's The Dead from 1914's Dubliners may be the most famous work of classic fiction set entirely around Christmas. And I will link to all of these articles in the show notes. So The Dead is set not on Christmas night, but at Mrs. Morkan's annual dance on 12th night, which is in the first week of January. And it is very significantly the night before the Feast of the Epiphany. So Epiphany, or the concept of Epiphany, is a huge theme throughout Dubliners, where ordinary people struggle with the reality of their existence, with stories that often end in disappointment or realisation. This is very clearly defined in The Dead through Gabriel Conroy's anxiety-laced journey and final realisation, and it emerges in different ways throughout the other 14 stories that make up Dubliners. While The Dead does take place around the holiday season, it's not alone in its use of the holiday. In the lead-up, references to Christmas bobs up a few times in Dubliners. In The Sisters, on page 13, the unnamed boy at the centre of the tale says, "I drew the blankets over my head and tried to think of Christmas." Later, in the story A Painful Case, Christmas is noted as a time for family. On page 133, in relation to the isolated Mr. Duffy, he lived his spiritual life without any communion with others, visiting his relatives at Christmas and escorting them to the cemetery when they died. Ugh, I love that turn of phrase. He really gets into it throughout this book. Some of the phrasing really almost took my breath away with what he's doing, and it kind of makes me sad that he abandoned that lyrical style later on to really dig down on the language, but I understand why he did. Peter Crisp notes in his excellent Joyce blog From Swerve Shore to Bend of Bay, which we've already used earlier in the Wake podcast to discuss the bodies of water in the Anna Livia chapter, Crisp talks about Joyce having written an incomplete story called Christmas Eve, which would have, if it had been completed, it was published in a couple of different areas as an incomplete story, and this story later repurposed a couple of phrases from Dubliners in the story Clay. You can read that incomplete story at Peter's blog, which I'm going to link to. So in this story, Christmas Eve, character Tom Callanan reflects positively on the benefits to Christmas, noting that he was annually gifted, quote, a present of a small load of wooden blocks from a friend of his in a timber yard near Ringsend. Christmas would not have been Christmas without a wood fire. This simplicity really throws us back to a different time where Christmas gifting was not about the excesses of junk from today, where it's just about pile on pile of presents and things that people don't really need, but more about a place where a gift of something simple, something useful to their lives, like wood to burn in the cold season or a candy or a piece of fruit would have been prized. The idea of the holiday season being a time of togetherness, of family, of warmth and plenty, comes up most vividly in the final story of Dubliners, The Dead, which is essentially a novella. As I mentioned earlier, this is at the Morkan Sisters' annual dance, and the holiday is effectively celebrated and includes a unification of family, comments on the growth of children, a program of entertainments, and a feast, which Wallace describes as Dickensian in proportions. This is how Joyce describes the spread. A fat brown goose lay at one end of the table, and at the other end, on a bed of creased paper strewn with sprigs of parsley, lay a great ham, stripped of its outer skin and peppered over with crust crumbs, a neat paper frill round its shin, and beside this was a round of spiced beef. Between these rival ends ran parallel lines of side dishes, 2 little minsters of jelly, red and yellow, a shallow dish full of blocks of blancmange and red jam, a large green leaf-shaped dish with a stalk-shaped handle, on which lay bundles of purple raisins and peeled almonds, a companion dish on which lay a solid rectangle of Smyrna figs, a dish of custard topped with grated nutmeg, a small bowl full of chocolates and sweets wrapped in gold and silver papers, and a glass vase in which stood some tall celery stalks. In the centre of the table there stood, as sentries to a fruit stand, which upheld a pyramid of oranges and American apples, 2 squat old-fashioned decanters of cut glass, one containing port and the other dark sherry. On the closed square piano a pudding in huge yellow dish lay in waiting, and behind it were 3 squads of bottles of stout and ale and minerals, drawn up according to the colours of their uniforms. The first 2 black, with brown and red labels, the third and smallest squad white, with transverse green sashes. That's on page 179. The 12th night feast is the backdrop to the dead, and despite the nationalistic jibes and concern about alcoholism, the nostalgia of memory and family anchors this incredible story, which are foundational to the holiday, at least for me. There are standard ideas of gifting, which is simple but meaningful. On page 162, Gabriel arrives and meets the sullen young Lily. He knows the importance of a gift. Quote, "When he had flicked lustre into his shoes, he stood up and pulled his waistcoat down more tightly onto his plump body. Then he took a coin rapidly from his pocket. 'Oh, Lily,' he said, thrusting it into her hands. 'It's Christmas time, isn't it? Just, here's a little.' He walked rapidly toward the door. 'Oh, no, sir,' cried the girl, following him. 'Really, sir, I wouldn't take it.' 'Christmas time, said Gabriel, almost trotting to the stairs and waving his hand to her in deprecation." End quote. The traditions of Christmas time bob up in passing with reference to Aunt Julia's dedication to the church, once singing in the choir at 6 a.m. on Christmas Day, although it is a point of bitterness that the elderly choristers have been replaced with a boys' choir. Miss O'Callaghan similarly speaks on page 193 to her expectations of what a Christmas should look like. Quote, "I think Christmas is never really Christmas unless we have the snow on the ground." I know a lot of Canadians around here in my new home of Toronto who feel the same way as this, although as I grew up with the sweltering hot Australian Christmas, I'm not sure if I'm fully on board, although I do like a little bit of snow on Christmas too. Even the most hopeless member of the celebration party, the drunken Freddie Malins, who is a cause of great concern throughout much of the story, is revealed on page 199 to have a little more motivation than we might have thought, when Gabriel notes to Greta that he loaned Freddie money for his, quote, "little Christmas card shop in Henry Street." And what's more, Freddie has successfully repaid the loan, which suggests that he may be turning the corner. Even though Gabrielle Conroy ends the novella in a reverie of regret and self-reflection over the fleeting nature of life, it's bound up in a cocoon of warmth and familial connection. Conroy gets his epiphany on Epiphany Day, which would feel heavy-handed if it weren't so beautifully stated. I really loved getting the chance to reread Dubliners this week, of a simpler time where ordinary people muddle their ways through, despite the disappointments that come from all corners. While it's not exactly a Christmas story, of course it is. Family, conflict, ennui, joy, all fleeting glimpses of our own mortality. It doesn't smash you in the face with Christmas themes, but it remains incredibly evocative of the season. As Kevin D. Camillo observes in the National Catholic Register, it is a book that in this era of non-stop torrent of skipping Advent and starting Christmas the day after Thanksgiving, takes the reader back to a time of venerable Christmas traditions. Getting dressed up for Christmas, the singing of carols, playing the piano and not the radio for one's guests, and of course the lively discourse over the Christmas goose. What is particularly well handled and enjoyable here is that all of this is delivered not in some saccharine, wasn't life so much simpler than way, but as Joyce himself said, like looking at oneself in a well-polished mirror. I loved reading the Dubliners. I loved having a chance to reacquaint myself with these stories, and I think they're going to stick with me a lot better than they did after my first read a decade ago. The collection was published 110 years ago, and even though it depicts a world much more simple in many themes to what ours is, it's still so immediate and so relevant to everything that we're dealing with these days. It's a really, really worth another read. So moving on from Dubliners, a portrait of the artist as a young man was published right around this time of year, on December 29th, which is my sister's birthday, in 1916. She was born a little after that. And it's about as autobiographical as Joyce got. Stephen Dedalus represents the author as he navigated his youth and school, and Christmas is evoked on numerous occasions. The contrast between the privations of boarding school and the intimate warmth of Christmas is an easy one to draw. My father often talks about that difference between being home with his family in a warm Christmas environment and the difficulties of being away at boarding school. Joyce didn't have the happiest of home lives, but clearly Christmas brought up fond memories. We first hear about Christmas in Portrait on page 11. Quote, "But the Christmas vacation was very far away. But one time it would come because the earth moved round always." That comfort of life, always grinding towards a moment of joy, is a major motivation in places like boarding school. Being away from family can make you feel very small indeed. The decorations of Christmas clearly brings out fond memories. On page 18 we hear the use of, quote, "holly and ivy for him and for Christmas," and not long after we gain a strong account of a Christmas dinner. On page 26 the comfort of the hearth predominates. Quote, "A great fire, banked high and red, flamed in the grate, and under the ivy-twined branches of the chandelier the Christmas table was spread. They had come home a little late, and still dinner was not ready, but it would be ready in a jiffy," his mother had said. They were waiting for the door to open and for the servants to come in, holding the big dishes covered with their heavy metal covers. Pretty ideal, right? Lots of family vividly drawn, but also a sense of how Stephen is growing. On page 28, he contrasts himself with his younger siblings who are not invited to the adults' table. Quote, "It was his first Christmas dinner, and he thought of his little brothers and sisters who were waiting in the nursery, as he had often waited till the pudding came." End quote. Feels very similar to the feast that lies at the centre of the dead. Of course, the downside to being at the grown-ups table is getting into the opinions of relatives, including debates about politics, a time-honoured tradition and one that similarly exists in Dubliners. On page 33 we get the brunt of this belligerence. Quote, "I think there were more strangers down than last Christmas." He looked round at the others, whose faces were bent towards their plates, and receiving no reply, waited for a moment and said bitterly, "Well, my Christmas dinner has been spoiled anyhow." End quote. I don't know if any of you have those kinds of relatives. I don't. I'm pretty lucky. But it's if media's taught me nothing else, there's always one relative that shows up to ruin it for everyone. So hopefully it doesn't feel too familiar to you. Things continue to descend into chaos until on page 37 we hear, quote, "Well, I let her bawl away to her heart's content, Kitty O'Shea and the rest of it, till at last she called that lady a name that I won't sully this Christmas board nor your ears, ma'am, nor my own lips by repeating." End quote. The Christmas episode is a turning point for Stephen, and not long after he moves schools. Later on in the book, Christmas gets its final reference on page 73, where the Christmas decorations have taken on a less joyful meaning. Quote, "He went once or twice with his mother to visit their relatives, and though they passed a jovial array of shops lit up and adorned for Christmas, his mood of embittered silence did not leave him. The causes of his embitterment were many, remote, and near." End quote. Following on from Portrait, Joyce published Ulysses in 1922 after serialised excerpts had bobbed up over the previous few years. Ulysses, being set in June 1904, is set at the direct opposite season to Christmas, so there are obviously no references to Bloom engaging with the holiday season during his journey. Even so, Christmas does emerge a handful of times. Our first few references link us to what we consume on Christmas. On pages 84 and 163, we have references to Christmas dinner and Christmas turkeys and geese, while on page 341 we get reference to Mr. Tunney the grocer's Christmas almanac, with the consumerism of the holiday laid bare, although in a fashion we might call quaint today. Reminiscences of Christmas past arise, Scrooge-like too. On page 423 we think back to past Christmases, an energy common at times like this. Quote, "How time flies by. Do you remember harking back in a retrospective arrangement, old Christmas night, Georgina Simpson's housewarming, while they were playing the Irving Bishop game, finding the pin blindfold, and thou shredding?" End quote. The festivities of Christmas are about togetherness. On page 618, we hear about the artistic mores of the day. Quote, "He could easily foresee him participating in their musical and artistic conversations during the festivities of the Christmas season. For choice, causing a slight flutter in the dovecoats of the fair sex, and being made by a lot of ladies out for sensation." And on page 632 we get reference to the second edition, 30 January 1893, of the grand annual Christmas pantomime Sinbad the Sailor. I love a theatrical Christmas, and it's always nice to go to the theatre with your family. Finally, on page 691, the drama spills over into scandal. Quote, I went into the kitchen pretending he was drinking water. Woman is not enough for them. It was all his fault, of course, ruining servants, then proposing that she could eat at our table on Christmas, if you please. Oh, no, thank you, not in my house, stealing my potatoes. A Wakean phrasing, if ever I've heard one. Yes, by the end of Ulysses, we start to see the habits that make The Wake such a fun read, with experiments with phrasing and spelling and punctuation. Obviously, within the world of the earwickers, Christmas is hardly tangible. As HCE dreams on, he's likely doing that in December. I recently participated in the Maybe Night celebration of the night that HCE dreamed, being at the winter solstice of December 20, and if you're like me, the worries of the day tend to drift into the dreams of a night. So, if we're in a Christmas season, surely Christmas appears. Our first reference is on page 113 in a tone that very much echoes the schoolboy anxiety for Christmas to come during Portrait. Quote, I am a worker, a tombstone mason, anxious to police Averybury's, and duly glad when Christmas comes his once a year. End quote. As we've discovered over our reading of The Wake this year, phrasing often doesn't follow a linear progression, so logic is often so deeply buried that the presence of words needs to either be fully forgiven or dismissed. So, on pages 186 and 87, quote, Sergo, search me, the incapable reparteed with self-evident subtlety, so obviously spurious, and raising his hair after the grace, with the Christmas under his clutch arm for portsy massa and purtsy messes and pertsy miss and partsy maesters, like a prance of fandingos with a shilto, shalto, slipney, stripney, in he skittled, end quote. Ugh, I have to love that alliteration. The phrase, with the Christmas under his clutch arm, refers to the Christmas foliage you might hang on the door at Christmas, and that explains why it's written with a lowercase c. We also get a lengthy take on Christmas on page 209 as part of the Anna Livia chapter. Quote, well, a run-girond in a waveney line, a ring-a-rumour she pattered and swung and sidled, dribbling her boulder through narrower mosses, the dilly sky drear on our drier side, and the vild vetchvine a Guinness, curara here, career o there, not knowing which medway or weeser to strike it, Ida rider, making chattahoochee all to her ain chee-chee-choo, like Santa Claus at the cree of the pale and puny, nistling to hear for their tiny hearties, her arm encircling Isola Bella, then running with reconciled romers and rhymes, on like a lech to be off like a dart, then bathing dirty hands spatters with spittle, with a Christmas box a peach for each and every one of her childer, the birthday gifts they dream they gave her, the spoiled she fleetly laid at our door. End quote. Here, obviously, we get a sense of Anna Livia's generosity, along with the lengthy list of gifts she provides, which further marks Joyce's idea of the safety that Christmas represents for him and his family. Other references show up on page 289 of the Night Lessons episode. Quote, and by leave in the old waits down upon the Swanee, innovated by him the Prince de Propagandie, the chrism for the Christmas, the pillar of the perished and the rock o' rail reality, and it is veritably belied, we belove, that not all sods of his soup cans that's in the Queen's potage pot post, and not all finds of green and gold that the Indus contains would over-induce them, OP, to steeple change back once from their office workship, and twice on sundices, to their ancient flash and crash habits of old palest time, air beam, slewed cable, or Dertzer, live wire, fired benge, ermine, funkling out of the empire, sin, right-hand sun. Now, I didn't need to read all that, but it's so much fun to read The Wake. Lots of fun with Finnegans Wake. Can you tell? I'm really going to miss this when we're done. We get another Santa Claus reference at the end of Night Lessons in the long list prefaced by an Aesop reference that anticipates the insect porn that so amused us in our episode with Lucy a few weeks ago. This is on page 307. Quote, tell a friend in a chatty letter the fable of the grasshopper and the ant. Santa Claus, the shame of slumdom. End quote. On page 490, during Yawn's defence to the Senators for, the provider's role at Christmas again emerges. Quote, treble storter of Holy Bagot Street, formerly sword meat, who I surpassed him lately, to 4 and 6 bringing home the Christmas, as heavy as music, hand to eyes on the pier for Noel's Arch, in blessed Foster's place, is doing the dirty on me with his tantrums and all these God-forgiven kilowatts I'd be better off without. She's right to him, she's left to by me, Jenny Redidiver, toot, better for you, Mr. No Brew, toot toot, better for you, Mr. Anol. This is the way we, of a red dead day morning. End quote. We get another theatrical reference on page 513, which takes up the idea of Christmas pantomime, corrupted in a delightfully Joycean way. Quote, out of Prisky Propagenua, the palsy old Priamite, home from Edwin Hamilton's Christmas pantaloonade, Oropos Roxy and Pantharia at the Gaiety, triputating round the area with his 52 heirs of age. They may reel at his likes, but is Noah bonum shindu. End quote. Then on page 542 we get a reference that seems to be more geographical and holiday themed, referring to the Christmas Steps, which is a district in Bristol. Interestingly and Joyceanly, the Christmas Steps is actually a corruption of the road's original name, which was Knifesmith Street, which was corrupted to the Christmas Steps, which is amazing. That was corrupted during the 15th century. Joyce would be very proud of that kind of corruption. Here's the reference. Quote, for, while I oplooked the first of Janus's Strait, I down saw the last of Christmas Steps. Syndic, Podestril, and on the rates, I for indigent and intendite, in forum foster I demonstrated my folks' fiendship, and me pupils felt my Burke was no worse than their bright. Sappho Greta and Conscientia were undecidedly attached to me, but the Morga Macries and the anti-parthenopes of my squalby words with littered spongelets set their soaky pokies and botch-bonds afume. Fletcher Flemings, Elizabeth, how interquackeringly they rogated me, their golden one. I inhesitant made replique, mesdesdems to Lear's sponsor, and who in Hill say, don't you let fly fire till you see the whites of the bunker's eyes. Mr. Answers, bring 'em young, bring 'em young, bring 'em young. Okay, that's more than I needed, but I'm enjoying myself. So, what can you do? Christmas comes up once more on page 555 with a collection of holiday references. Quote, night by silent sailing night, while infantina Isabel, who will be blushing all day to be when she growed up one Sunday, Saint Holy and Saint Ivory, when she took the veil, the beautiful presentation nun, so barely 20, in her pure coif, Sister Isabel, and next Sunday Misselmass, when she looked a peach, the beautiful Samaritan, still as beautiful and still in her teens, Nurse Saintette Isabel, with stiff starch cuffs, but on holiday, Christmas, Easter mornings, when she wore a wreath, the wonderful widow of 18 Springs, Madame Isa, Vive la Belle, so sad, but luxom in her boy blues long black, with orange blossoming weeper's veil, for she was the only girl they loved, as she is the queenly pearl you prize. End quote. And obviously you may remember the wonderful widow of 18 Springs was the title of the John Cage composition that Joey Ramone covered, that we have talked about in past episodes of The Wake. So it's always nice to get those references, and I admire Cage for pulling a reference from page 555, Night by Silent Sailing Night. That was obviously part of that composition. Finally, on page 590, a page still in the future for our reading, we get this epic account. Quote, agreed, woo Welsher, he was chog-fulled to beaxate on urn as in hiving, of fox-old conningnesses, but who, hey honey, for all values of his latters, intergerimost, was the foremast of the firm. At folk mood hailed, at part far wailed, accumulated concloud, noir nebob of Nephilm. After all, what followed for apprentice sake? Since the now nigh's nearing, as the yet's highs hin, Jeebies, keck, pata, that was an ill man. Jaw boost, putty good, this is for true a sweetish man. But Jumbluffer Baghdad, sir, yon would be for once over our all-honoured Christmastide Eastered man. That exclamation precedes the final paragraph of Book 3. As Christmas time is noted as all-honoured, it sounds good to me. So, there's a take, or at least a compilation, of a couple of dozen references to Christmas in Joyce. Now, I've missed many, I'm certain. Purists, calm down. I didn't plan to. I literally spent 2 days putting this together, and as you can tell, there's been a little bit more background research into this than just about any other episode of Wake. But I wanted to put something together for you all and for my listeners. What I did want to point out, though, is that for Joyce, Christmas seemed like a complicated time, one for family and cheer and feasting, but one for also for anxiety and arguments and want. So, in other words, just like all of ours. So Joyce may have felt like he was isolated and on an island, but really everyone loves and hates Christmas in varying measures. Of course, right after Christmas, we have New Year, a fresh start, a new way forward, as Joyce notes on page 455 of the Wake, quote, "Hogmanay dee ye gut, hogmanay dee ye smelly gut, and hogmanay dee ye smelly spattery gut," end quote. I certainly hope that your Hogmanay or New Year does not include any smelly spattery gut, but if it does, drink lots of water. I spent New Year's Eve 1999 going into 2000 in a small town in Wexford County in Ireland, drinking at a bar in Gorey and staying in Camorlin, just near Enniscorthy. So New Year will forevermore be linked to Ireland and Guinness and Jameson's for me. So I feel that was 25 years ago exactly to this month, and so feeling wistful in some ways for my last real proper visit to Ireland. From all of us here at Wake, and on behalf of TJ, I hope you have a wonderful Christmas filled with cheer, or a joyful holiday season if you celebrate elsewhere. We will have another bonus episode next week for New Year, and we will return with our next reading in the first week of January. I've been Toby Malone, and 2024 has been made so much brighter by the presence of Joyce and all you Joyceans. I love you, purists. See you next week, reindeer lovers.
This has been Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, just to hear it out loud. If you've made it this far, thank you for your dedication. Join us next week for another segment of Finnegans Wake and a chat about what we've found. Wake is a Moon Street Media podcast, engineered by TJ Young and Toby Malone. Our theme song is The Ballad of Perso Riley, arranged and performed by Meg Logue after James Joyce. Wake is recorded in Canada, where Finnegans Wake is in the public domain. For community and bonus content, join us at our free Patreon at patreon.com/wakepod. If you have questions about Finnegans Wake, don't ask us. We're just as confused as you are. See you next week.